Good afternoon. May I have your attention?
The organizers of this conference asked me to monitor this session. I'm happy that they found some time to discuss with you any issues related to WMD and terrorism. Today in the morning we quite extensively discussed the success of negotiations on the joint comprehensive action plan for Iran, the resolution 1540, which was adopted in 2004 actually was another success of creating an action plan based on WMD and public entities. We rather discuss the technical part of the resolution, but I should probably mention here the most essential part of this resolution. Under this resolution, all countries, not only UN member states, but all countries committed themselves not to provide any support to non-public entities to acquire WMD. And this is the essence of the resolution. And what was positive was that none of the countries and none of the governments would contest the provisions of this resolution. Nobody is claiming that there are some non-public entities that can be provided with WMD or else. And I think that these are the foundations for our quite serious effort to implement this resolution in the last 13 years. This is a consensus-based resolution which is supported by all states. This is a resolution which is an integral part of international security architecture, especially as related to weapons of mass destruction. But as it happens in real life all the time, unfortunately, new events are happening, and the committee for this resolution and the United Nations Security Council, I believe, would face a very serious challenge. It is not that hard to imagine that the next terrorist acts would involve terrorist acts with the use of WMD. It is not the weapons that is available to states, but it is rather weapons that were specifically produced for the purpose of committing such terrorist acts. This is also the result of the events in Syria. It was proven that terrorist organizations can acquire such weapons, quite advanced, and would not stop from using such weapons. And perhaps I would suggest our panel would pay special attention to this. How to use the capacity and opportunities of international cooperation to prevent such an outturn, but also how to react if it happens. Today, we have quite a strong panel to present their views, including international institutions, supranational institutions, and representatives of member states. But we would open our session with a special address from Mr. Voronkov, who was recently appointed as Under-Secretary General of Counter-Terrorism Office of the United Nations. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by thanking the Center for Energy and Security Studies and its head, Mr. Anton Kholobkov, for organizing this important conference. I would also like to thank the government of the Russian Federation for its support in convening this event. I commend the efforts of the government of the Russian Federation in preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, including through Russia's leading role in the implementation of the joint plan of action on Iran's nuclear program. As the head of newly established United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism it's an honor for me to address this distinguished gathering. Your discussions will address a topic that is of high importance to the international community. How can we benefit from the opportunities presented by nuclear technology while fully ensuring that challenges, risks, and dangers associated with this technology, or for that matter, chemical and biological technology, are addressed and tackled with focus and resolve? It's critical that such technologies do not fall into the wrong hands, such as terrorists or other non-state actors. Earlier this summer, United Nations Secretary General Guterres established the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism as his first major reform. Through this office, the Secretary General wishes to provide leadership in the United Nations work to address counterterrorism and enhance coordination and coherence across the relevant UN bodies in the international organizations. He also aims to strengthen capacity-building activities in support of member states. We will need to work hard as one UN to fulfill these obligations. In the area of WMD safeguards, I remain committed to engaging closely with all relevant UN and other international entities, including the Office of Disarmament Affairs, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the World Health Organization, to build partnerships and ensure meaningful action. Ladies and gentlemen, the possibility of terrorists acquiring lethal technologies and new weapons, including those of mass destruction, is a serious threat to international peace and security and must be prevented. The Secretary General has placed prevention at his very core of his peace and security agenda. Over the years, terrorists have tested new ways and means to acquire and use more dangerous weapons to maximize damage. The use of chemical weapons by terrorist groups in Syria shows that this threat is real. We must ensure that we remain focused on the illegal and legal commercial channels, including on the dark web, that could be exploited by terrorist groups to gain access to dangerous technologies. The implementation of the obligations under relevant Security Council resolutions are vital in preventing non-state actors from acquiring and using nuclear, chemical, radiological, and biological weapons. The United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, adopted by consensus in 2006, provides the mandate to my office. The strategy, among its many provisions, calls upon the United Nations system to improve international cooperation and coordination in planning and response to a terrorist attack using nuclear, chemical, biological, or radiological weapons or materials. The UN Office of Counterterrorism, through its interagency working group on preventing and responding to WMD terrorist attacks, has been working in this critical area. The current activities of the working group are focused on reviewing and improving the effectiveness of the existing interagency coordination mechanism to respond to a chemical, biological, radioactive, and nuclear attack. Earlier this year, the working group also organized a pragmatic tabletop exercise at the OPCW that brought together 16 agencies to test their coordination in a hypothetical terrorist attack situation involving WMDs. Going forward, my office remains committed to assisting member states in preventing WMD attacks and promoting interagency collaboration to ensure such a calamity never take place. Only through cooperation and partnership we can collectively address this global challenge. I look forward to working closely with all of you and wish you a successful conference. Желаю вам успешной конференции, успехов в вашей работе. Спасибо.
Мы сейчас продолжим в соответствии с той программой, которая была объявлена, как здесь уже установилось. Первоначальная презентация до 7 минут, с тем, чтобы у вас было время. Okay. We will proceed according to the program. This conference, первоначальная презентация.
Well, the presentations will have 7 minutes, and then you'll have time for Q&A. I give the floor to Madam Ritori. She is Eugenia Ritori, Political Affairs Officer, Counterterrorism Office, United Nations. Counterterrorism Office, United Nations. You have the floor.
It's a pleasure to be here today with all these relevant experts in such a good conference with very solid agenda. I believe that the message of the USG has been very clear, so I have some additional information to add. I would like to share today in this 7 minutes intervention what we're doing within the office. It's a very newly established office. Has been created in June 2017, but it has assumed 2 entities already existing within the United Nations working on counterterrorism. One of them is the CTITF, that is the Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force that has more than 38 entities of the UN working on counterterrorism. So it's a platform for cooperation and coordination. And then we have another program that is the United Nations Centers on Counterterrorism and is working on capacity building programs. So both entities that were previously under DPA, that is Department of Political Affairs, have moved to the newly established Office of Counterterrorism. So this shows the importance of the international community has put in the CT topic. And also the General Assembly has decided to create this office. So it's quite relevant for the international community that there was a need for an office on counterterrorism. Has been already described by the Undersecretary General the functions of this office. I would like to also mention the framework of the UN for combating and preventing nuclear terrorism. We have several conventions. We have a global strategy. Let me just list the main 5. That's the Convention of the Physical Protection on Nuclear Materials from 1980, the UN Security Resolution 1540 that will be presented by my colleague Gennady, the International Convention for Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy that also addresses CBRN in its Article 5 and 17, and the International Atomic Energy Agency Nuclear Security Plan. These are relevant instruments that the international community has put in place to deal with combating and preventing nuclear terrorism. In addition to these, there are many other activities from different UN and international organizations. Some of them I may list to you now. Global initiatives to combat nuclear terrorism that is co-chaired by Russia and the US, and it is a platform of 89 countries dealing on voluntary basis on activities for preventing nuclear terrorism. IAEA also has its INSSP, that is the Integrated Nuclear Security Support Plan, helping countries in developing security strategies, the database of IAEA on illicit trafficking of nuclear and radioactive materials. Interpol as well, they have activities on prevention, but also operational support for member states. The EU and United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute with the Centers of Excellence Initiative, that is a capacity building program that is present in more than 65 countries. UNODA supporting 1540 committee and the experts in the implementation of the Security Council resolution, and as well UNODC, that is United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, and the Terrorism Prevention Branch, dealing also with support to member states in ratification and implementation of international framework dealing with CBRN. Let me mention more specifically what the Office on Counterterrorism is doing. We are supporting member states in implementing the global strategy on terrorism. So in Pillar 2, there is measures for combating and preventing terrorism. There is a specific article on CBRN on combating crime, particularly illicit trafficking of CBRN materials, and Article 17 that also deals with calling the United Nations entities and international community to coordinate and collaborate in prevention and response to potential CBRN terrorist attack. There was a fifth review of the global strategy on 2016, and it's renewed the commitment of the international community to combat CBRN terrorism and preventing non-state actors from acquiring these materials. At the same time, we have a working group within the CTITF that deals with weapons of mass destruction prevention, terrorism prevention, and response. It's integrated by more than 15 UN entities. Among them, I could mention IEA as the chair and OPCW as the co-chair, Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and IEA, I guess all of you know already. But there is also response entities like OCHA, that is the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Interpol, also UNODC, UNDP, 1540 Committee, WHO, UNICRI, UNODA. So this is just to mention the framework of cooperation that exists within the UN in combating CBRN terrorism. And in particular, our office has been dealing with three main activities. One was a report with IEA, 2010-2011. Was international response and mitigation to a terrorist attack using nuclear and radiological weapons. Basically, the conclusions were the IEA had a very strong mechanism of coordination with other agencies to combat terrorism, and it was suggested that a similar mechanism was reproduced in the chemical and biological community. After that, the office decided to embark in a project on interagency cooperation among agencies of the UN dealing with chemical and biological attacks. And this is a project that has been running since 2014 to 2017. It has three phases. One was a gap analysis, what was missing in the UN system to combat and respond to a terrorist attack on bio and chem. The second phase was a set of recommendations and tabletop exercises. And we are now entering into the inception phase of the third phase that will be dealing with technical exercise, field exercise with volunteering member states. So I hope I covered it all, what we are doing within the UN to try to improve measures put in place to combat and prevent terrorism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. And the next on our list is Ambassador Sharma, Director for Department for Disarmament and International Security from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of India. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, very good afternoon, and fellow panelists. I'm honored to speak at this session as part of this distinguished panel. I'm grateful to Dr. Anton Khlopkov, Director, Center for Energy and Security Studies, for his kind invitation to this important conference. Colleagues, I come from a tradition of speakers who, when they speak, the audience actually doesn't look at the watch, they look at the calendar. But Nikita Petrovich has asked me to only confine my comments to 7 minutes, so I shall do so out of respect to the host. 25 years ago, I began my career as a diplomat in this wonderful city of Moscow, while also studying at the Moscow State University. It is therefore like homecoming to me. This year, India and Russia commemorate 70 years of establishment of their diplomatic relations, and this makes my return even more special. Excellencies, we are here to deliberate on a very important issue. The threat of WMD terrorism cannot be overemphasized. Global developments, more so in the past couple of decades, have highlighted that terrorism remains the most insidious and serious challenge to international security. Developing a comprehensive global response warrants the highest priority. This would require a two-pronged approach: to act decisively against terrorism in general and to prevent unauthorized access to WMD-relevant technology and material. To address the former, India had tabled a draft comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism in 1996, which still remains on the agenda of the UN. Why this convention has not been adopted even after 21 years is another story. It is pertinent to note that if access to WMD-relevant technology affects the behavior of nation-states, it is bound to impinge on calculations of non-state actors who are seeking to maximize devastation, both physical and psychological. This, therefore, will be a continuing concern, especially as terrorist groups and non-state actors strike deeper roots and explore different avenues to spread terror. Effective international cooperation requires political commitments and assurances by sovereign states for protection of WMD-relevant material and technologies under their control from falling into the wrong hands. However, political commitments alone cannot suffice. Such commitments will need to be backed by international instruments. In this context, the international community gave shape to its collective will through the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1514/2004, which has provided the most important framework for cooperation among states to address WMD terrorism. It merits attention that India had provided one of the building blocks for this framework through a landmark resolution titled Measures to Prevent Terrorists from Acquiring Weapons of Mass Destruction, which has been adopted by the UN General Assembly without a vote since 2002. International forums such as IAEA, OPCW, and BWC Implementation Support Unit also provide an enabling framework for addressing WMD terrorism, as well as fostering international cooperation in this regard. Treaty instruments such as the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism and the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and its amendment provide a firm basis for translating broader political commitments into legally binding measures, as also brought out by my fellow panelist, Maria. Increasing use of radiological sources for peaceful applications brings an added element of risk of diversion for nefarious purposes. The international community is addressing this threat with various tools, including through adoption of a code of conduct. And we have also seen other initiatives, for example, the Nuclear Security Summit, the current Nuclear Security Contact Group, and also initiatives like GICNT. And we were privileged to host the Implementation Assessment Group meeting of GICNT in this February in New Delhi. Now, as to another component of WMD terrorism related to chemical weapons, an open-ended working group on terrorism in the OPCW has contributed to the body of work on chemical terrorism. Successive review conferences of the Chemical Weapons Convention have noted that full and effective implementation of all provisions of the Convention is a significant contribution to the fight against chemical terrorism. Only last week, the Executive Council of the OPCW adopted a significant decision on addressing the threat posed by the use of chemical weapons by non-state actors. The threat posed by terrorists and non-state actors gaining access to biological agents is also real and demands our urgent attention. It may be important here to recall the Russian initiative in the Conference on Disarmament for an international convention on suppression of acts of chemical and biological terrorism. Excellencies, the rapid advancements taking place in science and technology add another dimension to the threat of WMD terrorism. And when we superimpose all-pervasive cyber threat, the resultant picture is even more frightening. Having analyzed this threat, let us deliberate on the way ahead. Combating WMD terrorism requires multilateral efforts as well as synergy between various disciplines, such as scientific research, industry, science and technology policy, international security policy, disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control, international law, as well as ethics. In this context, India has decided to retable its resolution on the role of science and technology in the context of international security and disarmament at the 72nd session of the First Committee of the UNGA, which reflects these core concerns. Multilateral export control regimes and national export controls are another strengths of international cooperation, which provide key tools for prevention of the misuse of agents, technologies, substances, which otherwise are meant for the development of the society. Intangible transfers of technology are an important element in this context. Stringent adherence to comprehensive export control measures therefore assumes paramount importance. Sensitization and awareness raising is also critical in preventing access of WMD technology to non-state actors. OPCW Advisory Board on Education and Outreach presents a good example of fostering international cooperation in this context. There's no magic wand which can give us one solution to the complex web of WMD terrorism, and we need to take a holistic approach encompassing on a number of steps, small or big, leading to address this scourge. We need to energize our shared multilateral forums to foster a collective will. Meaningful dialogues like this are a step in the right direction, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Следующий выступающий
Next speaker, Ambassador Jacek Bilic, Special Envoy for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, European External Action Service. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Chairman, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. I subscribe to everything what was said by the previous speakers. Initially, I was thinking of flooding you with 15 pages of quotes from important European Union documents, such as the EU global strategy, the EU strategy against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, EU strategy against illicit trafficking in small arms, light weapons, and their munitions, CBRN action plan, and so on and so on. And I think I could stand up to any even UN document in terms of length. However, I was reminded of this story of a certain multilateral diplomat who comes back home after a mission, after a conference, and his wife is barely dealing with children. One child is crying, another is something is. So she shouts to him, "What have you been doing for this week?" And he takes out a document from his briefcase and he said, "See paragraph 72, the word notwithstanding. It's my achievement." Okay? So, because in international organizations we sometimes actually have these sort of achievements, I decided to start with a certain paradox. And the paradox is the following. In Europe, the number of terrorist attacks now is actually smaller than 40 years ago in the 70s. The number of victims of terrorist attacks is smaller than in 70s. And yet, we consider the level of terrorist threat to be higher than it was before. What explains this paradox? It is because the aim of terrorism is terror. And this depends not only on the actual damage on the ground, not only on the number of victims, but on the influence on people, on the public, the fear, so the psychological, the political, the social, and sometimes even economic consequences of a terrorist attack. This is why, and this is my first point which I'd like to make, it is very important in the current media environment to take into account strategic communications. When you deal with the prevention of terrorism, when you deal with also crisis management, when you prepare for consequence management, it is absolutely crucial to take into account that we are now operating in a very different media environment, a very thick, I would call it, media environment. Anything that's happening in the streets of any interest, especially something bad, is going to be photographed. A video will be made by somebody because everybody carries a camera. And within minutes, thousands, tens of thousands, or maybe hundreds of thousands of people will actually receive this message, will see something happening. And the 24 hours a day news channels will keep on repeating this and speculating and asking experts and so on. So in this situation, the communication strategy is something which we shouldn't forget. I believe that in the EU we have understood rather well the interrelationship between different kinds of threats. And early in 2003, the EU had a security strategy which listed 5 threats. Among them, failed states, regional conflicts, organized crime, proliferation, and terrorism. And the combination between them and the interrelationship is something which we should actually understand and try, in some cases, to break. Because it is the failed states that provide space for action, for organized crime, for terrorism, the ability to get access, for example, to dangerous materials. It is the organized crime which can sometimes cooperate with terrorists to provide financing for terrorist actions, and so on. So a lot of work that we do in other domains actually is also prevention of WMD terrorism. And here I fully agree with the previous speaker, Ambassador Sharma, that we need to look from the point of view of prevention of terrorist acts, but also from the point of view of prevention of access to materials. But things which are sometimes quite far away, and this is my second point, like spreading good governance so that we do not have failed states, or prevention of money laundering or terrorist financing, is actually very relevant to this special topic of WMD terrorism, which, because of this media environment, can have a very devastating effect, because people don't understand what is the exposure to radiological materials, chemical terrorism. It has an effect much larger than the actual destruction on the ground. And the third point which I'd like to make is about the importance of cooperation on the regional level. Because, yes, the prevention of terrorism is primarily a national responsibility, and it also is so inside the European Union. Yes, there are very precious initiatives on the global level in which the EU actually participates. They were listed by the first speaker, like the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. But it is at the regional level where the EU sees a lot of work needs to be done. We are doing this inside the European Union. We have a CBRN action plan, which actually works to prevent or to mitigate the consequences of different scenarios, including industrial accidents, including natural disasters, but also the terrorist or criminal use of CBRN materials. But we also have this network, which was also mentioned by the UN speaker, the network of CBRN centers of excellence around the globe, which currently includes 8 centers with involvement of around 60 countries. There's one in Tashkent, for example, for Central Asia, where we encourage regional capacity building, the creation of regional networks of experts, and also regional exercises. There will be one, for example, how to deal with chemical terrorist attack organized in Central Asia. So this is the kind of partnerships at the national, regional, and global level which we should work together. And obviously the Syrian case, which was mentioned by our chair, is something of major concern to the EU, and whoever is accountable, whoever is responsible for the usage of chemical weapons or chemicals as weapons should be held accountable. This is obvious. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Belevsky. Следующий выступление.
Next speaker, Gennady Lutai, expert committee established pursuant to Security Council Resolution 1540, United Nations. Mr. Lutai, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nikita. I would like also to thank organizers of the conference, Center for Energy and Security Studies, and personally Mr. Khlopkov for this kind invitation to attend this very important meeting. I can also inform you that invitation was extended to the chair of the 1540 committee created pursuant to the resolution 1540, the permanent representative of Bolivia to United Nations, and he planned to come and to address the conference, but unfortunately some urgent Security Council business prevented him from doing this. So I would like to repeat what Nikita already mentioned about uniqueness of Resolution 1540, which is now non-controversial document which covers 3 categories of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. And resolution has a full support of members of Security Council and of member states of United Nations. So resolution doesn't exist in a vacuum, so it complements other international legal instruments in the field of non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. In the preamble of the resolution, states were called upon to promote the universal adoption and full implementation and, where necessary, strengthening of multilateral treaties to which they are party, whose aim is to prevent the proliferation of nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. So resolution was adopted unanimously on 28 April of 2004, 25 April 2004, under Chapter 7 of UN Charter, measures to maintain or restore international peace and security, and reaffirmed by means of 5 follow-up resolutions. I will not give you numbers, but the last one was adopted in December 2016, Resolution 2023-25. So, very important element that this resolution is binding instrument, which addresses the threat posed by non-state actors. So we have clearly understand the scope. This resolution is not about states. It's about non-proliferation to non-state actors. Non-state actors including terrorists, of acquiring, addresses the threat posed by non-state actors, including terrorists, of acquiring nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, as well as their means of delivery. So proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, as well as their means of delivery, constitute a threat to international peace and security. As I said before, the resolution complements relevant multilateral treaties and arrangements. So the basic obligation of states is refrain from providing any form of support to non-state actors that attempt to develop, acquire, manufacture, possess, transport, transfer, or use WMD and means of delivery. A resolution requires from all states to adopt and enforce appropriate and effective laws that prohibit any non-state actor such activities, including acting as accomplice or to assist or to finance, and also requires states to establish domestic controls to prevent the proliferation of these weapons, including controls over related materials. Related materials are defined as materials which can be used for production of weapons of mass destruction. Sometimes there is a bit confusion. There are some radioactive materials which can be used for fabrication of dirty bombs. This is not covered by a resolution. The resolution only covers materials which can be used by non-state actors to produce weapons of mass destruction. So the resolution outlines obligations relating to what states have to do, but not how to do it. So modalities of implementation are a national decision. 1540 Committee, just briefly, this is a subsidiary body of Security Council composed of the 15 current members of the Council. Current chair, as I mentioned, Ambassador Sergio Laurenti Solis, Ambassador Permanent Representative of Plurinational State of Bolivia to United Nations. So this 1540 Committee is assisted by a group of 9 international experts. Also important element, the 1540 Committee is not a sanction committee, does not investigate or prosecute alleged violation of non-proliferation obligations. So mandate and scope of the activities of 1540 Committee are derived from Resolution 1540 and follow-up resolutions. So states are called upon to submit a report on the implementation of the resolution, and states that submitted initial report are encouraged to provide additional information, updated information. So this information is used as a basis for monitoring of implementing efforts. All but 15 member states have submitted at least one report. So 15 states includes some states from Africa, like Central African Republic, Chad, and includes DPRK, and some states from Asia, like Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste. One of the follow-up resolutions encouraged states to use such a tool as a voluntary implementation action plan, which can provide timelines and some direction for implementing different measures. So already 28 states adopted national action plans, which is a good tool to have interagency coordination and timely implementation of different measures. The resolution also recognizes that some states may require assistance in implementing resolution and invite those in a position to do so to offer assistance. So the 1540 Committee does not provide assistance, but it has a so-called clearinghouse role and matchmaking role to facilitate assistance by others to implement the resolution. There are some special procedures. Any member state can send official request to the chair of the 1540 Committee, and this request will be conveyed to all relevant organizations and to more than 50 states which volunteered to provide assistance. So committee has tailored dialogue with states. So the most important tool is a visit. Visits are on by invitation only. Committee also supposed to have cooperation with other relevant organizations, and these organizations like IAEA, OPCW, Interpol, WCO. So just a few words. In 2016, there was a comprehensive review. Previous took place in 2011. And this comprehensive review provided thorough analysis of how measures are implemented by states. And after the review, there was the adoption of the new resolution, 2325, which inter alia requested committee to take note, where relevant, of the continually evolving nature of the risks of proliferation, including the use by non-state actors of rapid advances in science, technology, and international commerce for proliferation purposes. So this concludes my overview of the, and I will be happy to respond to your questions.
Я хочу поблагодарить всех выступающих. У нас есть
We have about 25 minutes left, and I would like to thank all the speakers and panelists. And as the way goes in this conference, we'll have 4 or 5 questions first, and then our panelists will be able to respond. Ambassador Nazarkin, please. Thank you. The very notion of weapons of mass destruction would naturally include not only biological, chemical, and radiological weapons, but also nuclear weapons. And probably what is meant is that it is not only radioactive materials can be used, which nuclear weapons contain, but the weapons themselves can be used as exploding devices. My question is to all the panelists. How would you assess the technical capability of terrorists to acquire and to use nuclear weapons, that is, like explosive devices? I mean, it is hard to imagine that non-state actors would be able to to produce, to develop such weapons themselves. They can steal, yes, but to use such weapons, you need to have some expertise. You need to know the codes for the activation of such devices. So your opinion about the capability of the threat or use of nuclear weapons by terrorists. I'll start from the back rows, because usually they don't get the chance to ask their questions. So let's go from the back to the front.
David Santoro from the Pacific Forum CSIS. This is a question for Jacek Bilyat. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank all the panelists. Very good presentation, but it's a question specifically for you, sir. You mentioned capacity building at the regional level, and particularly the role of the 8 centers that you have. And I was curious to find out more about the specific capacity building that you do and how you do it at the regional level. Do you reach out to specific regional organizations? How do you build capacity at the regional level? I'm particularly interested in how you do so in Southeast Asia, and I think the center that you have is in Manila. And if you can elaborate a little bit more, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm Chima from Islamabad. It's highly appreciable that we should have bilateral and international conventions for elimination of weapons of mass destruction. In 1992, Pakistan signed a bilateral convention, chemical weapon convention with India, where both countries declared that they did not have a stockpile of chemical weapons. When India signed the Global Chemical Weapons Convention in 1992, India declared a stockpile of chemical weapons. That's undermined the credibility. If you sign an agreement with your neighbors and which is not in complete adherence to the agreement that which you had signed. More recently, you might have heard, many of you, Indian literature is full with having preemptive nuclear strikes against Pakistan's nuclear assets. The latest statement has come nobody less than the Indian Air Chief, that we will attack Pakistan's nuclear weapons in a preemptive attack, despite the fact in 1988, India and Pakistan has signed a no attack on each other's nuclear facilities. So I think it should be verification of the agreement, which is also equally important, rather than just signing the agreement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's not quite related to the subject of Resolution 1540. I leave it to Ambassador Sharma if you want to attach it. Otherwise, it will go beyond that. Please.
Thank you. Leon Ratz, Program Officer with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. My question is for Ambassador Sharma. Last year, your government announced that you will host a summit on combating WMD terrorism. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on your vision for the summit and what your goals and objectives are for the summit. Thank you.
Okay. One more question, please.
Richard White's Hudson Institute. President Trump, in a speech in August on the new U.S. strategy for South Asia, said that it was going to be a priority of his administration to combat nuclear terrorism throughout the world. The administration is still formulating its nuclear policy review, which includes this question of nuclear material security. But I was wondering if any of the speakers would like to suggest how the U.S. can most contribute to this mission going forward. Thank you.
Okay, as tradition here, we'll start in the reverse order. Mr. Lutai, please. If you have any comments.
Sorry. On this particular?
On all the 4 questions that were asked.
Yeah, but some questions were asked to specific persons. Yeah. Regarding use of technical possibility of use of chemical weapons, of course, this question should be nuclear weapons should be asked to specialists, to military people, military experts, how it's easy or not to use. But as far as 1540 resolution is concerned, resolution requires member states to adopt measures of physical protection, of accounting, physical protection and accounting, not only stored material, but also during transportation, during production, during storage. So this is a whole set of measures. And during comprehensive review, there was a conclusion that measures in the nuclear field are the most efficient and implementation level is very high. And this is due to the existence of very powerful international organizations, IAEA, due to safeguard systems, a lot of measures, a lot of assistance IAEA provide to member states. So this is, if we look at 3 types of weapons, we can say that the most of the measures are implemented with the assistance of IAEA. And of course, it's as you said, it's making a task of potential terrorists to acquire related materials or materials which can be used for fabrication of improvised nuclear device, making their task very difficult. But nobody knows. Yeah, and especially with rapid advances in science and technologies, probably there are new possibilities. It's also to be appreciated by experts, assessed by technical experts. But there are new possibilities which opens to potential terrorists or non-state actors who want use of these weapons. So I think 2 other questions, Nikita, were specifically. And 5th question
was concerning the current U.S. administration policies.
How can the U.S. most help your mission?
U.S. is one of the pioneers of this resolution, and we have very good cooperation. They, in close cooperation with the committee, they provided money to trust fund, and so there is a cooperation. It's like with other members of Security Council, especially permanent fives. Yeah.
Okay.
And we are in dialogue. We always discussing new programs, outreach activities, and other things.
Thank you, Gennady. Ambassador Bill.
Yes, thank you very much. the U.S. has taken the lead in many multilateral initiatives, especially in the prevention of nuclear terrorism. This is the GICNT, which was mentioned here, co-chaired by the US and the Russian Federation, in which the EU participates very actively. This was the Nuclear Security Summit process. Again, I had the privilege of being the EU Sherpa for the last summit. And we actually prepared a report on what the EU has done until 2016 in the field of nuclear security. Maybe I should have brought some copies. It's a brochure, but those of you who are interested, please approach me afterwards. I can send you an electronic version directly to your office. So there is a follow-up to those. I mean, obviously we stress, and this was also the case in the NSS process, that we recognize the primary responsibility of the IAEA. So one thing to do is let's not damage the IAEA and other international institutions, multilateral organizations, and so on. This is one sort of thing which we always in the EU say. We stand for the universalization of relevant treaties and instruments, and actually, in a way coordinated with the EU, we embarked on a wave of diplomatic démarches to have an entry into force of the amendment to the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Material last year. There were US démarches, there were EU démarches. In some cases, they were done jointly. But overall, this has helped, I believe. There is some follow-up to the NSS, which was also mentioned, Nuclear Security Contact Group. On the issue of CBRN COEs, this is a project which stems from the CBRN action plan. It is actually very well financed, and if we say in the EU that something is well financed, I mean we are talking about hundreds of millions of euros, and we cooperate with the UN closely. With UNICRI in this particular case. Capacity building is from awareness raising through trainings, exercises, and so on. I will be happy. I mean, I do not know specifically I checked the Tashkent Center before coming here, what their plans are for the next year. The one for Southeast Asia, I'm not sure. Please approach me with your card. I can put you in touch with somebody who would know. This is not done directly by my office. What I know, however, that it is not directly working with ASEAN, for example, or ARF. I don't think this Manila Center is working with ASEAN. Что касается вопроса
regarding the question of terrorists who might steal nuclear weapons, this is only one of the scenarios, and frankly speaking, as far as I'm told by experts, this is the least probable scenario. So we pay more attention, and we focus more on things like dirty bombs, where, of course, you may find many sources, also in the former Soviet Union territory and in other countries, for such bombs, or chemical weapons. And here I would like to go back to my first point, that unfortunately, this is the psychological impact that this is, and this is dangerous. So people wouldn't know whether it's a bomb or whether it's a backpack, I don't know. So information in the mass media would be that something blew up and that was something radioactive. I know that here in the audience we have experts from those countries who have nuclear weapons and who are probably well versed in how you provide protection for such devices, various electronic locks, etc. But I remember one of the experts mentioned that, how often do you hear that, say, our national bank was robbed, and I mean all gold was stolen from a national bank? So you probably never heard about this. So for our countries, nuclear weapons is like gold in the vaults of a central bank, and it is being protected.
The nuclear weapons. So I don't think this is a scenario about which we worry most. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sharma.
Thank you very much. It is not a mere coincidence that I have been put with a panel. With each of one, I have worked in some capacity or the other. With Gennady Lutai, I used to work in OPCW. With Ambassador Yalic, I have been working very closely. We have regular dialogues. With Maria, again, I got to work when I was in OPCW. Now, Ambassador Nazakin had asked a question about how do we assess, and I think the answer has already been provided. Nobody knows this subject better than Ambassador Nazakin, who has been a pioneer in the field of chemical weapons, but also other areas. And as rightly said, that probability seems very low. However, it cannot be completely ruled out. But what we could do is we could take countermeasures by strengthening nuclear security in our own countries, and also through various instruments, as was mentioned by my fellow panelists, and also in my presentation. Now, a question by the distinguished representative of Pakistan, I would skip it because it is beyond the scope of this panel. Maybe it was, if it was in some other panel, I would have responded suitably. As to the question on WMD Terrorism Summit, there was an announcement by Prime Minister Modi at the last Nuclear Security Summit. And that's a work in progress, so we haven't taken any concrete steps as of now, but as and when we are in a position to share the details, we'll be happy to do so. And we'll be consulting our key partners when we move to that step. As to the question about how U.S. could contribute to nuclear material strategy and nuclear security, again, fellow panelists have commented on that. U.S. has already commented immensely to the process. In fact, the Nuclear Security Summit was an extremely important process. And then it has also contributed through GICNT in cooperation with the Russian Federation, as well as the Nuclear Security Contact Group, which got formed after the Nuclear Security Summit process got wound up. 2 points I could add, that is capacity building and outreach, if that could continue. And secondly, if U.S. could support and strengthen the role of IAEA. And U.S. supports that. In fact, it has emphasized the centrality of IAEA in the nuclear security process. It has been extremely supportive of that process through funding and through various other means. And I believe that would be another key contribution to this whole process. So I would conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I think there is not much to add because everybody covered all the questions. Just to stress of what the U.S. can do is keep on working with GICNT to use the legacy of the Nuclear Security Summit, as well as cooperation with other regional initiatives like the Centers of Excellence, for instance. Regarding the Centers of Excellence, maybe I can give some reference because I was the regional coordinator for Southeast Asia Center. So I was there 5 years. I worked together with the partner countries. Here we have a focal point of Myanmar as well, Dr. Lat. So there is no direct cooperation with ASEAN, is correct. So the regional cooperation is among the 10 ASEAN countries. Let's say they joined bilaterally, but they work as the region. So it's a similar format to ASEAN, but without ASEAN. So mostly capacity building projects cover from training. There has been also masters and nuclear safeguards in Bangkok. There have been many projects on security and also on response. Actually, Southeast Asia was one of the most active regions We have cooperation with IEA, OPCW, WHO, so all international organizations. So I hope that also helps to answer the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Probably we have some more time to ask a question, but to speed up, please ask a question to a specific participant so that he can answer, please.
Spasiba, thank you. John Gower used to run the policy in the United Kingdom from MOD on these subjects and have worked closely with Jacek in NATO before, but haven't had the privilege of working the others. I just wanted to slightly turn back to one of the questions and phrase it in a slightly different. What kept me awake in the daytime was the nuclear threat. What kept me awake at night was biological and chemical weapons threat. And yet my country spent probably about 80 to 95% of its resource on the nuclear threat and about 50 in terms of intelligence and everything else. And I would just seek reassurance, primarily from Jacek and perhaps from Ambassador Sharma, that despite the intense publicity, referring back to the question of the US's administration's focus on nuclear terrorism, that sufficient resource and sufficient energy will continue to be generated countering the other weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, which for me are more likely, easier to do, more difficult to counter, and more generating terror in its genuine sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand that it was addressed to Ambassador Bilic and Ambassador Sharma, please.
The short answer is there is I think, sufficient attention also given to chemical terrorism, the prevention of chemical terrorism. We, as the EU, are watching closely, cooperating with the OPCW in The Hague. There is a working group on non-state actors. We also independently fund projects, for example, on chemical safety and security in Ukraine through the OSCE, so that in the current situation, actually, the chemicals stay safe. With bio, it's slightly different because the international structures are weaker. I mean, our first instinct in the EU is look for an organization, treaty, structure, which we could support and work with them and ask them, what do you need from us? The implementation support unit of the BWC is modest, also the agreements, but yes, I mean, there are also other methods like the CBRN Centers of Excellence. So I don't think that there is not enough attention. I think it's spread all across the board.
Thank you. Ambassador Sharma, please.
Thank you very much for the question. And as Ambassador Bilic mentioned, both biological and chemical terrorism get sufficient attention. And I can vouch for that through my personal experience. I was on deputation to the OPCW, and I worked in the implementation support unit. And the way we went about developing capacities in member countries, especially the developing countries, and also about universalization of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So it does get sufficient attention, and countries are more than willing to make resources available to that. We had EU funding for that, a very big amount, and also funding came from UK, Canada, US, and other countries have contributed to that cause. In terms of BWC, again, I agree with Ambassador Bilic. This year, India has decided to take on the chairmanship of the annual meeting of states parties, and in that capacity, we would also like to contribute to strengthen the process, which will also contribute to that. Thank you.
I think we will ask to finish at time, so I would like to finish this session and would like to express gratitude for our participants. Please join me in thanking them for their time and effort.